If you have an institution where someone isn't in charge of enforcing the standards, what you have is an institution that is soon wallowing in distrust.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. In this episode, Acton's librarian and research associate Dan Huger speaks with lawyer and chair of Common Good Philip K. Howard about his new book, Everyday Freedom: Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society. Why do so many people feel so powerless today? How is it important for people to experience everyday freedom at work, in school, and in all of life? What forces in American life today stifle our sense of freedom and responsibility, and how can they be countered to ensure a flourishing society for all? And what special role do people of faith have in empowering others in their community to realize their freedom and responsibility? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I am joined by Philip K. Howard, lawyer and chair of Common Good, a nonpartisan organization aimed at replacing red tape with human responsibility. He is also a best-selling author of many books, including The Death of Common Sense, How Law is Suffocating America, and Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. Today we'll be discussing his latest book, which is now hot off the presses, Everyday Freedom: Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society, published by Rodan Books. Philip, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you, Dan.
So, Everyday Freedom begins with a very powerful and striking claim. In the first 2 pages, you say, powerlessness has become a defining feature of modern society. And it's a very sort of existential observation, which has both a sort of psychological and a sociological dimension. Could you unpack what this feeling of powerless feels like for people on sort of a personal level, and then what it looks like as people go through their day-to-day lives?
Yeah. Well, just on the second, somebody goes to the office, they can't possibly tell a joke because somebody might be offended by it, right?
Yeah.
Particularly, how do you call it? Someone leaves the firm, they want a job reference. The firm will say, no, we don't give job references. We only confirm that they work here because they're afraid they might get sued. You get notes all the time. Have you completed this year's DEI training?
Yeah.
Or anti-harassment training? If you're in a factory setting, you're constantly being told to comply with this regulation and that regulation. Is your paperwork in order for the OSHA inspector? And a lot of that is literally sort of absurd. Like, do you have serial safety data sheets for anything that might be hazardous, including, well, in one case, the company got a fine for not having a safety sheet for Joy dishwashing liquid. That sort of thing. So people find themselves kind of overwhelmed by these requirements, all of which kind of repress their spontaneity. Mm-hmm. And at this point have actually more or less suffocated spontaneity. You'd be a fool to say what you really think in almost any public setting.
Yeah. So you've got this pressure when you were talking about those work requirements. I remember I had a cousin who years ago used to work for UPS, and he always told me that it was a mistake when he accepted a management position because all of a sudden he's supervising the line and a package would fall off the conveyor belt, and his management, he could no longer simply pick up that package and put it back on the belt because according to the union contract that was reserved for the unionized workforce and not for management.
Right. So in every, I had this book last year that got a lot of attention about public employee unions and their collective bargaining agreements. Just apropos, they could prevent managers from making any adaptive choices during the day. I had a friend who was a deputy mayor under Mayor Bloomberg who wanted to go around and ask civil servants if they had any ideas about how better to perform the public services, and he was told that would be unlawful as direct dealing, that you could only negotiate with the union rep. So you have a system of government that is quite literally unmanageable, that everything has to be what desk somebody sits in has to be negotiated. In healthcare, doctors and nurses spend half their day filling out forms, and it causes burnout because they're constantly having to comply with these systems that don't make any sense. I mean, I'll tell you another story. So, a friend of mine was president of Johns Hopkins, and he's talking to a doctor. He's a doctor. He was having his conversation with a doctor friend whose reimbursement form kept getting bounced by the insurance company. Why is it being bounced? Why is it being bounced? Finally got a real person on the line, right? And why is it being bounced? Because you didn't check the box that said, have you asked the patient whether she was a smoker? And the doctor said, I didn't check that box because the patient is 2 years old. So you have these systems in schools and hospitals, really everywhere, that kind of press down on people so that they no longer feel they can be themselves. And then when they look at the big picture, they see a government, Washington in particular, that can't do anything. It can't give a permit for a transmission line that everybody agrees is needed. Even the president doesn't have authority to do that. And so you have this system that's literally paralyzed.
Yeah. So you have these people that become alienated from their work, they become alienated from their government, and it's sort of they don't experience what you call in the book, and you develop this concept of everyday freedom. And everyday freedom also has a sort of psychological and a sociological dimension. What is everyday freedom? When people have everyday freedom, how do their lives look different? How does their experience as workers, managers, citizens, how does that feel different?
Right. It's replacing a compliance model of law and society with a human responsibility model. So you can tell people what to do. You can't pollute. You've got to have a safe workplace stuff, but you can't tell them how to do it without ultimately creating this system of central planning. And one thing I didn't mention, but is important to me personally, and maybe relevant to Acton, my father was a minister, and so when I was growing up in a little town in southern Georgia, I would follow around with him. He would minister to the prisoners in the work camps, and he would build missions and that sort of thing. Big government has really repressed that. I mean, they've made it very hard for communities, and particularly churches, to take ownership of social services. And if we want to rebuild a coherent society where people feel a sense of pride because they're owning their own communities, they're taking ownership for the homeless person and figuring out who that person is and all of that. They need the authority to do that. They can't comply with some distant bureaucratic requirements. So it's giving people the freedom to do things in their own ways. It's not, quote, deregulation. There are lots of, we have a society where there are lots of externalities, right? So you want law to not only to protect against crimes and all that, but to make sure that we feel confident that the water we're drinking isn't polluted, et cetera. So the government and the workplaces we're in are reasonably safe. But that doesn't mean you have to turn that into, a kind of a central planning model.
Yeah. And there's a historical argument that you make in your book that's nestled into, how did we get from the world in which people like your father felt the sort of everyday freedom to reach out to prisoners, to start missions, to start programs, and to start ministries. What's the historical account of how that everyday freedom was lost, and what motivated those sorts of changes in law and culture, and that really changed the fabric of American life?
Yeah, it's so funny and it's so clear. I mean, there is a straight line. Mm-hmm. So what happened is that we woke up to a number of abuses and bad social values in the 1960s. Segregation, pollution, unsafe cars, gender discrimination, lies about Vietnam, ending up with a sort of the maraschino cherry of this culture, this decade of distrust with Watergate in 1972. And so we needed to change our values, and we did. The civil rights laws, and we had the Environmental Protection Act, and safety standards for cars, et cetera. But the culture of distrust motivated the brilliant people in charge. That not only did they want to change our values, but they wanted to guarantee that there could never again be an abuse of authority. And so they changed the way we governed. And there were three tools that they came up with to do that. The first tool was to not only tell people what they had to do and give them principles like the Constitution, free speech, or no unreasonable searches and seizures or whatever, that's fine. And they can be interpreted. They wanted to tell people exactly what to do. So we've never such thing as a 1,000-page rule book before the 1960s. And all of a sudden we had a worker safety law that had 4,000 rules. Stairwells shall be lit by natural or artificial light. That's helpful. I mean, how else are they going to be lit? I mean, it's pages on what an industrial grade hammer should look like. I mean, it's crazy stuff, crazy detail. And then for things where you couldn't have a rule, like whether to give a permit for a transmission line or something, you would have processes. And these legal processes had the presumption that the correct answer could be objectively determined. And so we now have environmental review processes, which are generally good ideas to inform a judgment. But if you have them replace the judgment, they never stop. So literally, we have thousands of pages of no pebble left unturned. They don't illuminate environmental choices, they obscure them in thousands of pages of detail. And they can go on for a decade or longer, these things. And ultimately, whether you build a power line is not a matter of objective proof. It's a matter of trade-offs. Do we value the clean energy coming from the wind farm more? Do we value the views? Or can we build it on the wetland or not? We get clean energy if we do that.
Yeah.
So all, public choices all involve trade-offs, and it's not, quote, right or wrong, black or white. And so these procedures, the teachers have lost the authority to maintain order in the classroom. They have to be prepared to prove in a hearing that Johnny threw the pencil first. Well, how do you do that? You call other students as witnesses? I mean, it's it's sort of crazy. So the second thing was this idea of process that goes on forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing, I mean, how do you prove somebody's not a good worker? How do you prove somebody's not a good writer, doesn't try hard, doesn't cooperate, doesn't, all those things, none of those things are readily provable, right? You can second guess the judgments, but they involve human judgment. And the third thing was the idea of individual rights got completely changed. Before the 60s, the idea of individual rights, hallowed idea of individual rights, was protections against state coercion. Government can't take your property away or tell you what to say. It was a shield against state power. The new idea of rights is a sword by any angry person who claims that any decision is unfair to them, in the workplace, anywhere. So now you have people, making decisions just to avoid the litigation with somebody. You keep an employee that's dragging down the entire office because you don't want to deal with their claimed rights. It's just too much trouble. There's no, in the public sector, there's basically zero accountability because it's almost impossible to prove in a hearing that a teacher that everybody knows is horrible and bores students and all that is no good. So, like there's an 18-year study in Illinois that found that an average of 2 of 95,000 teachers a year were dismissed for poor performance.
Yeah,
think about that. And they've got really lousy schools. So it's a and the problem with no accountability is not that just that you need to get rid of bad people, which you do, is it's like letting the air out of the balloon. Everybody knows performance doesn't matter. So the culture of a place kind of sinks and it becomes a kind of saggy, discouraged place rather than a place with energy and pride. And Paul Volcker had a bunch of commissions on civil service where he talked about this. Basically, it's nothing more discouraging than being in a place where everybody knows performance doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the consequences of this loss, the sort of dispirited state that this sort of circumstances, this sort of legal regime can lead individuals and institutions. But you identify another casualty of this sort of legal regime as well in the book, which is the entire concept of the common good. And you make an argument that this preoccupation with potential violations of individual rights also weakens our sense of there being a common good, and that affects common goods not only of government but of organizations and institutions as well. How does that work out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, people sometimes say, well, the government suffers a management problem. And I say, no, government's suffering from a philosophy problem. There's a wrong philosophy. And so, noted former Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., 100 years ago, once said that one of the most important aspects of law is to take into account considerations of social advantage. In other words, law itself involves trade-offs and compromises and such. And and philosopher John Rawls in 1970, a very famous liberal philosopher, said that individual rights were not subject to the calculation of social interests. So just the opposite. You have to do whatever somebody wants. Now, if individual rights means you can't take somebody's property away, then fine, that's great. But if individual rights means you don't like the power line and society needs the power line, then all of a sudden you have a society that can't name it. It can't deal with the homelessness problem. It can't build modern infrastructure. It can't run a school. Last year, there were 23 schools in Baltimore where not one student is proficient in math, and they have no authority to change anything in those schools. So, I mean, because of, quote, individual rights of the teachers or whatever, so you just can't run a society that way.
Yeah, you can't develop a consensus, and you can't craft the compromises that are sort of necessary for a civilization.
Right, and of course, the most obvious paradox we haven't talked about yet is honoring these so-called rights undermines everybody else's rights.
Yeah.
So the rights of the disruptive kid in the classroom, honoring those means that the other 29 children don't have the right to learn, because one disruptive kid takes up all the attention and nobody can learn anything. So, and that's true throughout. So modern concept of rights is incoherent, because it not only destroys the common good, it destroys everyone else's rights.
Yeah. Now, you've identified how changes in the law have led to the erosion of this sense of individual freedom and this erosion of the common good. Is there a path back to that sort of way of living in everyday freedom through either reforming some of these legislation, some of these legislative initiatives that find their roots in the 60s and 70s, or are there other sort of cultural mechanisms to push back on this? And what would that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. Good question. Good leadership can't deal with this. Excuse me, or not good leadership alone, because these rules and these procedures and these rights are embedded in law. So the teacher literally doesn't have the authority to manage the school. The principal literally doesn't have the authority to manage the school. So you have to change systems from this compliance rights model to a human responsibility and accountability model, which is, again, how our country was framed. That's what the Constitution is. And that requires a whole series, basically, of expert commissions, area by area, say, okay, we're going to replace these 10 million words of law here with a set of principles and goals, and it's going to be 10,000 words of law or whatever, and clear lines of authority and accountability. I'll give you an example of how that works.
Yeah.
A couple of decades ago in Australia, they had terrible nursing homes, just as America, by the way, had terrible nursing homes. And they were regulated with a thick rule book, told everybody exactly how to do everything in the nursing home. Somebody had the bright idea of scrapping the rule book and replacing it with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents, stuff like that. They were still regulated, but they were regulated in accord with these principles. The experts said, oh boy, these nursing home operators are going to get away with murder. We hate to think what's going to happen now. They came in a year later, and what they discovered were the nursing homes were twice as good. Mm-hmm. And the reason they were good is because people now came into work and they focused on what the residents needed, not on compliance with these 1,000 pages of rules.
Yeah.
And it didn't let the nursing home operator do whatever he wanted. It was still subject to regulatory oversight. And in fact, it empowered residents and their families to make suggestions about how better to do things. So the response wasn't, no, that's not in the rules. The response is, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that would make a better home-like setting or whatever.
Yeah.
People would sit down and talk and discuss it. So there was innovation, but it became human. These are human enterprises, just like schools and hospitals are human enterprises. They require responding to the needs of each human. And that's what the system ought to look like. I've done a lot of work on infrastructure permitting reform and testified for Congress a bunch of times and stuff. And there, it's really clear what's needed are clear lines of authority to resolve the inevitable disagreements among the 17 different agencies that have jurisdiction over, the transmission line. And if you don't have those clear lines of authority to make those trade-offs and take those risks and whatever, it will never get built.
Yeah. So this is interesting because you spend a lot of time, and I think it's a good amount of time thinking through issues in the book about the erosion of social trust and institutional authority, and that those two things are both sort of major obstacles to any sort of reform. And this is one of those things where, when you need clear lines of authority, you also need people to buy into that. They need to trust that authority. They need to feel comfortable letting go of this regulatory apparatus. And how do you build that trust back up when you had, we talked about, the tumult of the 60s and 70s, a lot of people fell out of love with authority for, in many cases, very good reasons. But we've seen the sort of dead end that leads to. But how do you rebuild that trust among citizens and citizens' trust in institutions?
Really good question. First of all, America has never trusted government. I mean, Tocqueville talked about it.
Oh yeah,
So there's always been a healthy distrust of authority in this country, and that's fine. I don't trust authority either. My two older brothers used to get me up on the seesaw and then get off. So it taught me how to distrust people. Mm-hmm. So it's like the phrase trust but verify. So it's important for the people who have authority to do their job well. But there are two things I would say about it. The authority that I'm talking about in almost every setting, including a job or whatever, is more like a sentry on the sidelines guarding against people straying off into left field or doing something awful. It's not authority to dictate day-to-day choices. The framework. Freedom actually has a formal framework, which is law sets outer boundaries of what's prohibited, no pollution, no discrimination, whatever. And in so the same boundaries define a field of freedom where people can do whatever they want. And within that field of freedom, people need to be free to make moral choices and to decide which other people they have values in common with and they want to work with or associate with. Morality is a really key aspect of freedom that's been taken away by this legal compliance model. So if you're running an institution, a university, a firm, whatever, the university needs to say, these are our values and standards. We have to perform at this rate. That's the standard of performance. We have to be nice to each other. We don't tolerate immoral behavior of whatever sort, not telling the truth, etc. And they're there to make sure people meet the standards and don't violate the standards. But in general, those people inside are dealing with each other, and they're free to do that. And so it's not trusting somebody to be a dictator. If someone's a dictator, then you're not going to trust them because it's going to suffocate you just as badly as the law suffocates you, right? Yeah. Today. So there'll be people who run institutions that are good and people who are not good. And hopefully the people who are not good will be accountable to the people above them or the people who own the firm or whatever. And, there are a lot of ways to safeguard against bad choices. So I had this argument with the head of the teachers union at one point. I said, you don't need these impossible processes. Just appoint a parent-teacher committee They know the teachers, and give them the authority to veto a termination. They know who the good teachers and the bad teachers are. Fine. There are ways to put in speed bumps to make sure people are treated unfairly. And I think it's, as you say, trust. Freedom is all about trust. The rule of law is all about trust. It's about trusting that when you walk down the street, you won't be robbed, and someone won't run a stop sign, and the food you buy in the grocery store is not adulterated. It's all about trust. And trust dramatically enhances freedom because you can move forward. And so if you have an institution where someone isn't in charge of enforcing the standards, what you have is an institution that is soon wallowing in distrust because no one trusts that the other people are meeting their standards or doing their job. And again, a lot of studies on that.
Absolutely. Now, everyday freedom isn't just something, as you described in the book, that people exercise when the institutional constraints are right, but it's also something that communities exercise, that sort of civil society organizations do. We talked about this, religious groups do this sort of thing. People come together on this sort of playing field and cooperate in all sorts of ways. How do we encourage that? How do we encourage not only, let's say we get the legal rules and processes right, or we make some ground up. There's also a way that we have to be sort of re-socialized into doing these sorts of things, and I think community life is where it seems to me that it's natural to start. When you're talking about rebuilding social trust, it's much easier to rebuild it among, people you have a face-to-face relationship with. Those parent-teacher boards. It's a lot easier to build that cohesion and trust back up at that level than it is to, let's say, get people to buy into trusting Congress.
Right.
There's baby steps there. How do you see, if we can get the laws and the systems right, how do you see us getting back to a place where we have that flourishing society?
Really important question. As you say, trust is a human, is generally as a result of face-to-face relationships. There are studies that show that people with markedly different political views, when faced with the same problem, say a social problem, a social service problem, will address it the same way. So when you have people talking about abstractions, they can easily, go out into the stratosphere in different directions. And I believe in government. I hate government. Get away, whatever.
Yeah.
You give them a real problem, a real homeless person, a real family in need, or whatever. They'll say, how can we deal with this problem? And they'll tend to come at it the same way. And so I think there are a couple of things that need to happen here. First of all, we have to abandon the premise that there is one correct way of doing anything. Let communities and the people within them, within a broad range, do things in their own ways, figure it out for themselves. Not only that, give them the resources to do it. And not only that, not only don't put churches in the penalty box, these sort of abstract notions of the separation of church and state, but be extremely tolerant of, the purpose of a free society isn't to somehow disempower religion. So give the resources and authority to the community and there'll be all these people in the distance who distrust people. Well, what if Attila the Hun is running the community, or or what if Bob Jones decides to serve everybody poison Kool-Aid, or whatever. So you can have a distant uncle somewhere says we're going to periodically look at how well you're doing, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. Fine. That engenders broader trust too, because you have a kind of a distant oversight. But the most important thing is empowerment of the community, empowerment of the churches. Let people feel that they have both the resources and the authority to solve a problem, to own the problem. And and authority has a gravitational force. You give people authority, you give someone else authority even. People will migrate to that person and say, yes, let's talk about how to solve that problem.
Yeah. All of a sudden somebody's got that responsibility as well, that comes hand in hand. Now, moving towards the end of the book, you talk about how moving back to the exercise of everyday freedom is quote, not so much a reform as a complete change in direction, akin to the progressive era's abandonment of laissez-faire. End quote. You make this argument in a way that has a great deal of appeal to both secular and religious audiences. The sort of problems that we're talking about that everyday freedom seeks to address are everyday problems that everybody's going to recognize as they read this book. Right. They will have their own. They'll be able to make their own connections. And this argument has appeal, I think, both to secular and religious audiences, but you make two allusions in that final chapter that I noticed. One to George Washington's sort of providential understanding of America, and another to Pope St. John Paul II's understanding of the human person. And that provides like a very rich anthropology for understanding these questions. How do you understand the role of faith in a flourishing society? We've talked about the essential role religious communities can play in rebuilding this sort of everyday freedom. But I sense, and again, the argument I think works for both secular and religious people. But there are theological strains to it that I see that I'm curious about how that's informed your own understanding.
Well, again, I'm the son of a minister.
Yeah.
so I'm very much a believer in this. I think to me what is most upsetting about the current framework of law and government is that it doesn't honor our sense of right and wrong. It doesn't give each of us agency to live our values. Values are everything. There's this presumption in the current legal system that subjectivity is the enemy of freedom, that doing things because you believe them to be right or sensible is somehow the enemy of freedom. And what I argue in Everyday Freedom is that subjectivity is the essence of freedom. And people need the authority. Freedom is authority. The authority to live your life as you wish, your values. People need the dignity of that. They need to be able to have a faith in, if you're a Christian, in Christianity and its values and its sense of service. I mean, which was an incredibly radical innovation of Christianity. Sort of the take care of the Sermon on the Mount and all that. Yeah. And that gives people a sense of meaning, and it just creates an incredibly rich society. And you look at the communities that are more homogeneous, that that are organized around religion, the Mormons in Utah, or maybe the Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg, or whatever. Those communities have a richness because everyone is living their faith, and they rely on others to live their faith. And the faith gives them meaning and pride. And this legal system that replaces human agency with, just follow the rules it has created this wave of populist fervor that clearly explains the appeal of Donald Trump. It's not because he's a person of faith or religion or trustworthy or anything else. It's because he is basically disdainful of the current system, and many Americans are too, and for good reason.
Yeah. There's a portion, I think it's in the theory of moral sentiments, and this is something when I thought about this focus on subjectivity, and I was thinking, there's a lot in this book that reminds me a lot of Leonard Read of the Foundation of Economic Education. He had a notion of a freedom philosophy that was Leonard Read had his opinions about government and that government should be small and less intrusive, but it was really more robust about that. It was about people acting in the world, having that freedom to act from their subjectivity. And there's a portion of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments where he does a little digression. And Smith says, at some point, that, the reader might object to this very to this going back to sentiments and say, we have, basically God tells us in Scripture what's good and what's bad, and why not just follow that? Why go through all of this sentiments and fellow feeling and the rest of it? And he appeals to the golden rule. And he says, when Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, there's an introspective task there, is you have to think through what I would have done unto me. And you have to enter that sort of space of considering other people and considering their freedom of action in this. And I think this book really resonated with me because of those connections, because I think it really comes through how central the moral case is for freedom.
So true. And people don't appreciate, I just haven't thought through how complex accomplishment is, how complex human relations are, how complex the brain processes those things. It's all done in our unconscious. We see what we see. All these people trying to repress us. You must think this way. You must sign this statement or whatever. You can repress it, but you can't, in fact, cancel it, because people feel and see these things. They need reciprocity. They need the golden rule. Anything that doesn't comply with that is almost by definition unfair. So that people asserting their rights and getting things that everybody knows aren't fair because other people aren't getting them. It's the stuff of revolution. People hate it, right? So freedom is the freedom to own your beliefs. I mean, values, a society is its values. And its values are like Christian values. They're free agency. Christians are free to sin, and we're not in a position where we simply follow the rule book as Christians. And it's the fact that we make these choices for ourselves not to sin, or to do things that we think are right, or to forgive others who do and hope that they will continue to do what's right. It's all of those complex human things that freedom is supposed to, and human agency is supposed to give us. And people in America feel correctly that it has largely been taken away, particularly in their active life, in their jobs, in their communities, maybe not so much in their families. So I think we're overdue for a revolution back to freedom. But it's not what the conservatives say. It's not to get rid of government. It's not to blow it apart, which is what Trump says he wants to do. Is to restore the rightful role of human responsibility within government, as well as the rightful role of human responsibility in our daily lives and in our jobs. And it's, America has this vast reservoir of good people and goodwill and people who know what's right and wrong, and everybody knows it's broken. Everybody knows, but no one has a vision about how to bring it back and unleash this goodwill and unleash this energy. And so what I'm trying to do with this little 84-page book is, in the simplest way, because in my other books have lots of stories and arguments and stuff, I try to strip away as many stories as I can. I only put them in when I think they needed to illustrate a point. Strip away argument. I'm declaring what freedom is. I am declaring what that framework is. I'm declaring that the current system has to be abandoned. And if someone disagrees with me, I challenge them to tell me why I'm wrong, and to come up with their own system. Because I think we have to go back. This is basics. I'm going back to the basics of the Constitution and all the things we studied and the way freedom should work.
Yeah. Well, it's an absolutely stirring declaration. It's a riveting read. This is, again, for listeners, this is Everyday Freedom, Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society. We will link to it in the show notes. I would encourage. It is, so there's so many books today that you read and you're like, you know what? There's some great ideas in here, but it could have been half as long. This is not one of those. This is short but powerful. Thank you so much for giving it to the world, for us to consider and for us to wrestle with and for us to critique and embrace, and it's a conversation starter on where we are in America today.
Thank you, and hopefully to mobilize,
absolutely,
to come together, because this reform will not happen within Washington, because it changes the status quo. So, like all big change, it has to come from the outside. So I'm hoping to engage religious communities, other communities around the country, behind the idea of basic overhaul to restore the freedom to be ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us, Philip. And again, thank you all for listening.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.